6 weeks. In 1872, a company that had controlled just 4% of American oil refining walked into Cleveland and owned nearly every refinery in the city within 6 weeks. The men who sold rarely understood why refusing cost more than agreeing. They were never negotiating with a rival. They were negotiating with the only door out. That door had a name, and economists spent decades arguing about what kept it shut. In 1996, the economist Benjamin Klein, working with Elizabeth Granitz, published the answer in the Journal of Law and Economics. Standard Oil never controlled most of the oil in the ground. By 1879, it controlled 90% of the refining, the one narrow stage every barrel had to pass through on its way to a lamp or a stove, and the railroad contracts that decided who could move oil to that stage and who could not. A refiner with better crude, better equipment, cheaper labor still lost every time, because none of it mattered if the trains would not carry his oil at a price he could survive. He was never competing on cost. He was competing for access to a choke point someone else already owned. The obvious reading is that this is a story about 1879. It is not. Refining share cratered exactly where the story is usually told as finished. By 1911, in the regions where Standard's rail and refining network had sat for 30 years, its share was still above 3/4. In the newest oil fields, the Gulf Coast, California, the ones its pipelines had not reached yet, its share had already fallen to 10% and 29%. The choke point was never a fact about Standard Oil's size. It was a fact about the ground its infrastructure physically covered. But the mechanism did not retire in 1911, when the Supreme Court ordered the company split into roughly 34 pieces. It changed industries. It did not disappear. Anyone who assumes a court order like that is where a choke point mechanism goes to die has not been watching what happened to AI compute over the past 2 years. It is running right now in the industry every other industry is being told to adopt. One company holds 75 to 81% of the revenue from the chips that train and run frontier AI models. Not because it makes the only usable chip, because 2 other companies, Broadcom and Marvell, control roughly 95% of the custom silicon design work that would let a customer root around it, and because the hyperscalers spending $775 to $800 billion on AI infrastructure this year still need that company's rack architecture to plug their own chips into. Same shape, different century, a refiner who could not move his oil except through Standard's rails, a cloud provider who cannot deploy its own custom chip except through the interconnect the chip company still controls. And in August of 2026, the mechanism went one stage further than a rail rebate ever did. Nvidia's own chief executive, Jensen Huang, said in public that many of the labs buying his chips are growing faster than their own balance sheets can support, and that his company would finance the gap. $105 billion for one data center alone. The same company selling the chip, financing the customer's ability to buy more of it, and wiring its own architecture into whatever gets built with the loan. The 1872 version of that arrangement had a name too. A rebate on your own shipment, a drawback on your rivals, money paid on oil the company never refined. What changed between the rebate and the loan was never the mechanism. It was that nobody has had to pass a Sherman Act yet to notice it. Chief Financial Officer at a mid-size cloud reseller, the kind of company that buys wholesale compute and resells it to businesses too small to negotiate with a hyperscaler directly. 44, which matters only because 2 decades of that career were spent doing exactly one thing: making sure no single supplier could ever hold enough leverage to set his company's terms. 3 months ago, his board approved a financing package to expand capacity. Vendor credit, arranged directly through the chip supplier itself, at better terms than any bank on the table. He recommended it. On the numbers, it was the correct decision. What the numbers did not show him, because there was no line item for it, is that the same company now sits on both sides of his balance sheet. It is his largest supplier. It is now also his largest creditor. If it changes a price, a delivery date, a compatibility requirement, he is no longer negotiating with a vendor. He is negotiating with the entity that decides whether his own expansion gets funded. It is the oldest arrangement in industrial history, running through a fiber optic cable instead of a rail line. He has read the analyst notes, not on his own 3-month-old deal specifically, but on the broader vendor financing pattern it belongs to, the same pattern behind the $105 billion deal already making news this month. One firm calls it a durable competitive moat, a sign the buildout will keep running for years. Another calls it a warning sign, the same structure that let the dot-com crash hide its weakest companies inside vendor financing until credit tightened and the whole thing came apart at once. Both are reading the same filing. Neither can prove the other wrong yet. The pattern itself is 18 months old, and nobody has tested what happens when growth slows. He signed the deal anyway. There was no alternative financing at that price from any lender who was not also, somewhere upstream, dependent on the same chip. He spent 20 years making sure no single company could hold that kind of leverage over his balance sheet. The company that finally did was not a competitor he failed to see coming. It was the name on every purchase order he had ever approved. What we've been calling a choke point isn't a choke point. It is a choke point, plus a leash, and the leash is 150 years newer than the mechanism underneath it. Standard Oil's rebate system let it profit from oil it never refined. A drawback, paid on arrival shipment, extracted through rail contracts the company itself controlled. The 2026 version does something the 1872 version never managed. It makes the dependency renewable. A rebate is a single transaction. A financing agreement is a relationship that compounds, quarter over quarter, for as long as the loan is outstanding, and every dollar of it is denominated in the lender's own hardware. There is a name for this in an entirely different area of law: a tied sale, where one company controls both a product and the credit required to buy it. And regulators have spent a century deciding when that combination crosses from convenient into coercive. Nobody has made that determination yet for AI infrastructure financing. The arrangement is too new for a regulator to have ruled on it. Dario Amodei made a version of this point from inside the industry, not against it. His argument was not that concentration is fine. It was that people inside the industry already know exactly how this looks from the outside and are trying to get ahead of the reaction before it arrives on its own terms. If the choke point can be financed instead of merely sold, does breaking up the company that owns it even reach the part that matters? A court in 1911 could order 34 pieces of a refining and rail monopoly to separate, because refining and rail were physical things a judge could point to on a map. A credit relationship does not split along a map. It is less like a company selling shovels in a gold rush, and more like the shovel company also underwriting the miner's claims, collecting whether the mine pays out or not, and still owning the shovel either way. The court could reach the refineries. It could reach the rails. Nobody has worked out yet what it reaches when the choke point is a balance sheet instead of a pipeline. And the people with the least leverage over that balance sheet were never the ones signing the financing agreements. The refiners lost. Eventually, some of their descendants worked for the company that broke them. The court reached the pipes. It reached the rails. It never reached the men. They had sold their refineries in 6 weeks. The alternative was worse. Nobody sued on their behalf. There was a choke point on oil. There was no choke point on a person. In 2026, the choke point is compute, the financing, the rack architecture, every founder, every CFO, every engineer building on top of it is negotiating with the same door. But underneath every one of those negotiations sits a much larger group with no negotiation at all. No board seat, no financing agreement to sign or refuse, no balance sheet anyone upstream has to worry about. Just a wage, set somewhere upstream, by people they will never meet. What happens to the price of their work when the thing setting it owns the only door out?